Okay, I think we'll get started. There's lots of people pouring in, and we love the support that the BECC webinar series has been getting lately. So far, we have about 208 to 9 people showing up, and so the outpouring of support for this webinar series is great. We like to see people's excitement about these topics. Before we get started in today's webinar, I just want to take a moment to send our thoughts and best wishes to those who are affected by coronavirus, COVID-19, or those who have family or friends or acquaintances that are affected. Obviously, this does more than just affect us physically, but also financially and emotionally. And we're all going through a lot together. So please be kind to each other, supportive, and be empathic to your friends and family and neighbors. So with that, today's webinar is being hosted by the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, or ACEEE, myself, Ruben Sussman. I lead the Behavior and Human Dimensions program, and Maxine, who is our communications associates, are running the show today. So Maxine will take your questions. You can type into the chat box, and I'm just going to be taking care of the back end of things. So before we get started, I wanted to point out, again, for those who don't know, that the BECC webinar series is an extension of the BECC conference, which is the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. It's been taking place every year since 2007, and it's always been a critical forum for bringing forward and promoting the latest in behavior research for climate and energy. It brings together academics and practitioners and researchers from all stripes. So this year's conference is scheduled to take place December 6th to 9th. And of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic hanging over us, we're currently evaluating what form the conference is going to take, and we'll be looking for your input. So check your email, because we will be sending you a short 5-minute survey in the next couple of days, just asking your ideas on virtual conferences, hybrid conferences, in person, that sort of thing. And of course, check back to beccconference.org for updates. And thanks again for being part of the BECC community. And very importantly, I want to acknowledge our 2020 sponsors for the conference and for these webinars. Without these sponsors, we would not be able to do these webinars or the conference. So they're very important, and they're doing very critical work in this area. So check out their websites if you're interested in the nexus of energy, behavior, and climate change. And of course, if you're a sponsor and you're looking at this and you say, I want my eyeballs on the 300 people that are attending each webinar, let me know, and we can make that happen. The conference and the webinars are looking for more sponsors. So one last thing before we talk about the logistics and then get started is that this week we're doing the 5th of our 2020 webinar series, but the 6th webinar will be on transformational communications and increasing government ambition and public engagement on climate change. We're extremely excited about this one because George Marshall was the keynote speaker at BECC 2 years ago, and he really brought the house down for the entire conference. People were talking about his talk and referencing his talk in their own work. So please do check that out. You can register for free today on the BECC website. So a few logistics. All attendees are currently in listen-only mode. After the speaker's remarks, we'll open up the webinar to questions. So put those questions into the chat box at any moment, at any time. And Maxine's going to be looking at them and flagging them for you, and we'll be asking the questions to our speakers at the end. If there's any point at which we have to stop and your question doesn't get answered, don't worry. We'll be sending all the questions over to our speakers after the webinar, and they can touch base with you in person. You also don't have to furiously write everything down, because guess what? We're recording today's webinar, and you will get a copy of it after the webinar is done. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's webinar. Their two speakers are Michelle Hilscher, who's the director of BEworks. Michelle helps clients in the energy and financial services sectors to develop strategies that put behavioral science principles into action. And Sarah Carpentier is the associate working in the ideation design lab at BEworks. And as a behavioral scientist, Sarah has worked on several projects in the energy sector, most notably multiple large-scale successful projects conducted for the Ontario Energy Board, designed to change individuals' energy consumption behaviors. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Sarah, who's going to be walking us through the first part of the presentation. So thanks, Sarah, for being here. I'm going to transfer control over to you now.
Great, thank you. This and this.
Okay, seamless. I like that.
It was seamless. I'm just going to minimize this so I can actually see the slides myself, because I feel like that's probably a bonus. So welcome everybody. I'm really glad that everyone could attend today. And as you know, our topic is maximizing the impact of energy affordability assistance programs using behavioral economics. So what we'll cover today, we did our introductions already. We're going to talk a little bit about the challenge and how we view it from a psychological and from a behavioral perspective. And then Michelle is going to take over and she is going to take you through a case study that is about developing communication strategies for energy affordability programs. That's something that we worked on. And then, like was mentioned, we have our question and answer session afterwards. So lessening the burden of energy costs is a constant issue for a pretty actually large proportion of citizens, as I'm sure you know. But unfortunately, that proportion is increasing right now, or maybe increasing right now. And so it's really increased in importance with the realities of the current pandemic. People are spending more time than ever at home, meaning they're probably consuming more energy with more lights being kept on, stoves in use, air conditioning will be running. So with the unfortunate added squeeze of lost jobs and the uncertain times, no one wants to have to deal with also additionally increased energy bills that will cause additional strain. However, these energy affordability assistance programs have existed in many, many jurisdictions for a while, and they still fall short sometimes. So why do energy affordability programs fall short of the desired response from eligible beneficiaries? Why is there a gap still? So we look at this from a behavioral perspective. So what are the psychological barriers that are preventing people from engaging in the right behaviors to enroll themselves in the program that ultimately saves them money? Intuitively, it seems like there's free money on the table and people should just maximize that opportunity. But what we know is obviously a lot of them aren't. And so let's try and understand a bit about what's going on in people's mindsets, and then see what we can do to kind of help them out and help them get back on track. So to review for a second, kind of the traditional ways that behavior change is approached, the two main ones are education and incentives. And then also in the energy sector, as we know, there's a lot of various technologies, apps, smart thermostats, websites that kind of help you track your energy usage, that are supposed to help people manage their bills, manage their consumption, and manage their energy a little bit better. And education incentives, education being information. Maybe people just haven't signed up to the program because they don't know about it, so we need to tell them about it. So then the question becomes, do these approaches actually drive behavior? And they can certainly be a reasonable or intuitive place to start. Certainly a lot of the time there is a basic information void, right? You cannot sign up for a program that you do not know exists. But that knowledge frequently doesn't cause the behavior change that you want to see. So we do spend a lot of time providing information to people, and we assume, well, if they just know this, then they'll behave this way, or if they just have this perspective, if they know what I know, then they'll behave like me, or they'll do what a reasonable, rational person should do. And what we see is that providing more fine-grained information frequently doesn't work. So in this example, a while ago, the European Union introduced energy efficiency labeling onto all their appliances, and that's what's seen in the figure on the left, the A figure. And for 8 years, it was working, and it was considered very successful from the consumer perspective. People were buying more efficient appliances, and then on the other side, producers were then consequently making more energy efficient appliances. And this labeling system was also very valued by consumers. They said that they weighted it very heavily against other features like price and appearance when it came to choosing their appliances. So then the EU decided to double down and let's just do more of this. We gave people this information, well, let's just give them more information and it will help them do an even better job. And so they broke apart the A rating into an A+, A+, and A+++, and then B, C, and D. if we give people even more information about energy efficiency, then they'll choose the A+ ones or the A++ ones. Well, this study out of Germany actually found that people's purchasing of energy efficiency appliances went down after the rating was changed. The new labeling system led to lesser efficient appliances being selected by consumers. And the rationale, the theory behind this is that people feel like A is pretty good. I'm doing a good job. And A+ is probably even better, but they don't perceive that much more of a difference with A++, A+++. And so they kind of morally license themselves to, I got an A, instead of a B, I did a good enough job. And this is the case where they have all the information. They know that their appliance is not the most energy efficient choice, but they're fine with that, and they don't continue to make those more energy efficient choices. I could go on about information, but we do have a limited time. It really has limited effects regardless of domain. There's two other examples here. One is financial decision making. This was a company who was trying to get employees to enroll in a pension program, and they offered a seminar to tell them about how to do it and the importance of doing that, and educate them about everything about you need to increase your energy or your enrollment in the pension program. So at the end of the program, they asked participants at the end of the seminar, how many of you plan on making the changes? And the planned actions are listed on the left there. And 100% of people who were not already enrolled said they were going to enroll, but then only 14% of those people actually did. And then this compares to the last column of non-attendees, where people who didn't go to this seminar at all, they don't have any of this extra information, 7% of them enrolled. So yes, information can provide a little bit of a lift, but it really falls short of what you would expect, and it's not going to be the end all and be all. The example from food consumption is that, I don't know if there's anyone here from New York State, but a few years ago, they decided that chain restaurants need to print the caloric value of the foods on the menus. And that will help people consume less food that's very high calories or less healthy food that'll help them eat better. And then they decided after everyone had printed all their menus, they said, well, let's just do more of that. Let's add more information. Let's also include what the recommended daily intake is, causing all these restaurants to have to reprint their menus again a second time, unfortunately. And what they found is that actually backfired and went the other way. And having that extra knowledge of how much they're supposed to eat actually increased the amount of bad food that people were eating compared to before, when they had no information about the caloric intake. And what's happening here is people are kind of, again, licensing themselves. They're not doing all the math, and they just see, well, if 2,000 is what I'm supposed to have today and 500 was what this is, well, I'm doing a really good job. So you know what? I can supersize my fries and my drink, and I can eat even more. So in this case, these final menus were worse than just not having any caloric information whatsoever. So what about offering an incentive? Let's just pay people to do the things we want to do. That makes complete and total rational sense. So there's this old saying by traditional economists, there are no $100 bills lying on the sidewalk, because if there were, someone would have already picked them up. People don't just leave free money on the table. So Dan Ariely, who is a professor at Duke, and he's our chief behavioral scientist, tested this in a study. A bunch of the students from his lab set up a booth on the street giving away free money. It was just a booth that had a big sign, and it just said free money. It was not, they weren't vouchers, they weren't asking for any personal information, as we are all used to now exchanging for things that are supposedly free. No catches whatsoever. You didn't even have to ask for it. You just had to walk up and take a bill off the table and walk away with it. And they had denominations of up to $50. So maybe you can kind of think for a second in your heads of what percentage of people do you think actually took the money? And then I'll tell you that only 19% of people who were offered a free $50 bill with absolutely no strings attached actually took it. Another example of free money or owed money and why people don't necessarily behave the rational way that we would expect is when a consumer is missold financial products, they're owed money, and it's overseen by the Financial Conduct Authority. So firms who owe the compensation to people are required to send out letters telling them, we wronged you in such and such a way. This was, and we owe you this money, and here's how you can claim it. And again, you can think for a second about what percentage of people do you think actually claim this money that not only is they can think of as theirs, it is owed to them, it is theirs, and it is owed to them by a party who wronged them. So they might have some emotional investment in, you did something bad to me, you owe me something. Well, only 1.3% of customers actually claim that money, which seems astounding considering it's free money that's owed to them, and it should be relatively easy for them to claim. So there's so many psychological barriers that are preventing people from taking the free money. And one big one in both of these cases is a lack of trust. So they actually feel that, well, there must be some catch. It must actually be really hard for me to get it. There's actually going to be a bunch of physical barriers. They must want something. No one gives away free money. No one actually just does things to help people or be nice. They must want something in exchange. And so that really prevents them from following through and being able to get their free money. So behavioral economics then allows you to, it steps in to fill this gap between what we expect from a rational human and then how people actually behave. And it can be briefly summarized by saying that people are not completely rational, but they're also not completely irrational. They're boundedly rational. So that means that a lot of the time they do take rational factors into account somewhat in their decision-making process, but that they frequently and predictably veer away from this path by having irrelevant information be weighted too heavily in their decision-making process. So this is because of heuristics and biases. We have to simultaneously evaluate many competing pieces of information when making a decision, and we can easily be overly swayed by irrational factors. So behavioral economists believe that people are susceptible to influences from their immediate environment or other psychological influences, irrelevant emotions, short-sightedness, context effects, framing, many things that are listed here, loss aversion. But what this means is that the good news is that these mistakes do provide an opportunity for improvement. And if we all make predictable, systematic mistakes in our decisions, then we can use those to develop new strategies, tools, and methods to help us make better decisions and improve our well-being. So the knowledge that we have about these biases helps us kind of steer people back on track when they veer off a little bit. So a quick and salient example is context effects. And that's that, maybe you already know that the majority of people prefer to purchase a medium-sized cup of coffee. But the thing is, they do that completely regardless of how big that cup of coffee actually is, which makes no rational sense. People should just want a certain amount of coffee. And the context that it's placed in of, well, is there a larger one and is there a smaller one shouldn't matter, but it does. So you can very easily manipulate the sizes of coffees to get people to just drink a bigger one by adding an extra large size, and then more people will drink what used to be the large. So then how is the energy affordability assistance target population being negatively influenced by behavioral biases in a way that is preventing them from getting the benefits of these systems? So one of the low and near income beneficiaries can be better and can be pretty well understood, or a little bit better understood, through the lens of the scarcity mindset. So the scarcity mindset describes a state of mind that occurs when resources of any type, such as time or money, are in limited supply. And this phenomenon can occur in anyone given the right context. Some of you may be experiencing some of this in your lives to various degrees. However, it is most prevalent among lower income groups who deal with scarce resources all the time on multiple fronts. So having scarce resources leads to predictable changes in attitudes, intentions, and behaviors. One result of the constant burden of seeking sufficient resources is worse performance on cognitive tasks and diminished control over thoughts and behaviors. So for example, farmers display worse cognitive performance before a harvest when resources are scarce compared to after the harvest when resources are plenty. Scarcity mindset also manifests as present bias. So this is this increased preference for smaller, sooner rewards over larger, later rewards. Present bias shifts their attention to their most pressing needs at the expense of the quality of life of their future self. And this can really limit how much people save and particularly increase the likelihood of taking on a loan. There's also increased focus on opportunity costs associated with decisions, and unfortunately, increased prioritization of personal gains over pro-social behaviors. So communication strategies that ignore the scarcity mindset will inevitably suffer from limited effectiveness. So just to talk a little bit more about scarcity mindset and a couple of examples of how it impacts people and their decision-making process. This was a study where high and low income people were brought into the lab and they made financial decisions in hypothetically easy or hard scenarios. The hard scenario where you have to make a decision about is they were told it would cost $1,500 to have their hypothetical car fixed. The easy one is it's only going to cost $150 to fix your car. And they made a whole bunch of these decisions and then they measured cognitive performance. And there shouldn't really be a difference in the cognitive performance within each group, the low income group and the high income group, between the hard and easy scenarios. But there is. When you tax low income people with these hard financial decisions and you induce feelings of scarcity mindset in the lab, it can really have a negative impact on cognitive performance. Another example, like I mentioned, is the present bias. So participants in this study were of all equal socioeconomic status to begin with, and then they were divided into two groups, and they played a family feud style game, and they were given budgets of time per round. So there was a time poor group that was given only 15 seconds to answer questions, and then there was a time rich group that was given 50 seconds to make their decisions. They also had the opportunity to borrow time, but they would have to pay back this time with a fee on their next round of game winnings. So you're helping out your present self at the expense of your future self. And the results that are written down here at the bottom are the time poor group accumulated debt at a much higher rate than the time rich group, which perhaps makes some sense. Maybe they felt maybe they did actually need to borrow and they needed more time to answer the question. However, the rich group performed similarly when they could borrow or they couldn't. And it was only the poor group that they actually performed better when they were not given the option to borrow against their future time. So when they just took the 15 seconds, answer your questions, and do your best, they did really well. But the moment that they were able to think, well, I might be able to help myself out now by borrowing against my future, overall, it made them do way worse. So this is a brief summary of scarcity mindset and how it may apply to the beneficiaries of energy assistance programs is they may decide not to sign up for a program because it's too psychologically draining. They're already depleted. People have limited willpower, limited cognitive resources, and we get tired when we have a lot to think about all the time. And it's sometimes just too hard and you just put it off and I need to deal with these more immediate things. I don't need to deal with that right now. Again, unfortunately, some of us may be experiencing some of these things right now, these kinds of thoughts right now. They also may leave free money on the table in service of more immediate goals, like earning a paycheck. Again, this is, I have my immediate needs. This reward or whatever effort I have to put in might not be worth it compared to the thing that I actually need to focus on. I don't have the ability to split my attention. And I also might have misconceptions about the program because there's a lot of details and there's effort involved in understanding, am I eligible and what do I have to do and how will this help me? So while I hope to talk more about this and other barriers during the Q&A, I will now pass it off to Michelle to talk about our case study on designing communication strategy for energy affordability programs. I will add that we mentioned scarcity mindset because I think it's particularly relevant for energy affordability programs, but you can also get into a whole host of psychological and behavioral barriers that commonly prevent enrollment in all kinds of general programs, and those all still apply here. But scarcity mindset is particularly salient when designing program enrollment and communication strategies with low-income individuals. And unfortunately, the proportion of that population, of the larger population, might be increasing during present circumstances. All right, Michelle, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay, we're going to walk through a case study, as Sarah says, that we tackled together at BEworks, looking to see how we could actually get people to enroll and take part in an energy affordability program. And what we used is the BEworks method in order to really guide the approach for the project. So that's laid out on the next slide. And ultimately, there's kind of three main parts to it. The first is really about doing the research and better understanding the problem, defining, what would success look like if we're going to measure particular behaviors, and taking advantage of the insights that already exist. Behavioral science brings to the table many different insights about related topics at the problem level, in addition to what could work. So what might be the strategy that we could recommend to our client in order to improve the likelihood of people, being aware of and taking advantage of these sorts of programs. Ultimately, though, what we need to make sure we're doing is helping our clients to test and learn through experimentation. So what we'll be talking about today is an experiment that we helped to run for our client, and that helped to put to bed a lot of uncertainties and certainly point us in the direction of what is a promising direction. So thinking about the background here, this was a project that we tackled here in Ontario, where historically speaking, there have been quite high energy prices, particularly if we're looking at, residents in northern parts of the province, rural areas of our province. And consequently, the government here established a fund to help address this electricity pricing crisis, and to identify the households who are very energy burdened and offer them financial relief. And this program, the way that it has historically been administered is that there are local electricity distributors and utilities who work within the community with other partners in order to promote the program and also help people to actually enroll and take advantage of the financial supports. The goal was to, make this something that's available to as many households as possible. And the typical way that this program has been communicated about has been through very lean outbound means. So primarily emails. You'll see some posters around in the community, and that was typically, how the word is getting out. So we came on the scene. And what we started to understand is, well, what's on offer here? And one thing that's very notable about the program is that there are 3 levels of support that relate to the degree to which a household is burdened. And it is, when you think about the ratio, how much is it that a household is actually paying towards electricity? So if you're a level 1 energy burdened household, that means up to 3% of your income is going to pay for electricity. and you would be eligible to receive a home energy kit. So notable amongst the things that are offered there would be some more efficient light bulbs. So that's level 1. Level 2 is for households that are paying a bit more. The ratio is a little bit steeper, so 3 to 5% of their income. And if they register and are part of the program, they are able to have access to things such as appliance upgrades. You can get yourself a new washing machine, for instance, and also weatherization, in addition to the basic level 1, the light bulbs. Then you've got level 3. So this is for the most energy burdened households in the province. More than 5% of their income is going towards electricity costs. So they can get the light bulbs, they can get the level 2, appliance upgrades, and they can also have a heat pump that gets installed. They can have insulation put into their attic, those sorts of things. So definitely lots available. So I guess the next question is, well, where's the challenge? Who is needing the help to actually become enrolled? Because not as many households as one would expect have taken advantage of this available support. So looking at the historical data, we recognize that number 1, there are actually a high volume of inquiries that are coming into the contact center. Lots of people are phoning. So that means that there is some awareness out there in the community on the part of households. But what we recognize is that the households that tend to call in are those who are eligible for only the level 1 support measures, like the light bulbs. And that those folks certainly are being helped by the program. So there's more than 45,000 households that are benefiting from this program. What is untapped are oftentimes the resources set aside for level 2 and 3 supports. And you don't even see that there are a lot of people who call into the call center who would qualify for these supports, let alone that they move through the process and get those sorts of upgrades. Now, the kicker is that this program is going to halt intake of new beneficiaries at the close of this year. So ultimately, the goal is to get as many households who qualify for the level 2 and 3 supports through the door as possible before the program stops, enrolling people. That was ultimately our goal. And so we moved into the next part of our process, which is to apply a behavioral diagnostics to the challenge. And it's no mistake that Sarah was telling you a lot about scarcity mindset. That was a major theme in this project, because you have the need for a program to attract attention, create a positive impression, and drive action. And you also have a need for a program to match up with the fact that households that are experiencing an energy burden are experiencing a scarcity mindset. So what we did is we started to audit, well, what do the current state communication strategies look like? What do the emails contain? What are the brochures like? Are they likely to attract the right type of attention? Are they likely to drive action? Do they align with this scarcity mindset? And what we learned is that there were definitely some opportunities for improvement. So if we're thinking about attention, does the current communication strategy make it so that people are aware of the program? We recognized that it's tricky because this is actually a very new program and it's in competition with other programs that are more well-known. So it's an uphill battle at the best of times to differentiate your program from others that exist. The thing is, if you are also trying to communicate value and hook the attention of people who are experiencing a scarcity mindset, then you need to get to the heart of the matter as fast as you can. It needs to be very salient, and the value of your program needs to be really connected to the thing that's keeping people up at night. What's worrying them the most? And what we noticed is that a lot of the communications tend to be scattered with images of things like light bulbs. And that's not it, right? The light bulbs, free light bulbs, is not the crux of the issue for people. Instead, it's other things like the comfort of their home. They're not able to actually have a warm enough house because they can't pay for it. Or it might be, that there's really a financial challenge here that is causing them stress. Another thing that we learned when we completed the audit is that, stigma and low trust can interfere with positive perceptions of the program. So people don't like to ask for help, right? Especially if you happen to be in a near low income group, for example. You don't want to feel like you're the type of person who might qualify for a program that's offered to those who are financially burdened or who are in a low income group. You might feel like this is not a program that's for people like you, or you certainly don't want to be in that group. And when we completed this audit of the materials, we saw that this stigma threat was actually being triggered because the communications would tell people that this is a financial assistance program, as opposed to something that's more about alleviating an energy burden. The last thing that a good communications push should do is to make sure that people, if they feel like it's for them, are going to actually take action and do something. And what we learned was that the call to action oftentimes was quite vague and difficult to actually concretize what your next step would be. So it was very clear to us that even if people were aware and were intending to take action, that things could fall off and that they might not actually take the next step, which in this case was to pick up the phone or to, generate some sort of a message that would say, call me, I'm interested. So what we did is we worked on this foundation of behavioral diagnostics, these barriers that we had identified, and we came up with a whole bunch of different messages that would help to solve for these biases, these challenges. And we put them to the test using an experiment with more than 2,000 participants. And we made sure that, we had a number of different households represented in our sample. So we definitely had, high energy burden families included, as well as those from more of a low income or also a less burdened kind of household. And we explored a number of different strategic hypotheses. The first one was really around value and what you need to do in order to create that perception that there's something here for me as a person that warrants my attention, that warrants my effort. And what we recognized is that you are limiting yourself if all you do when you're communicating about this kind of program is to focus on the financial gains that the program is going to provide. Perceived value is driven by many other things as well. And so we started to develop, hypotheses about, well, what could be the other draws for this kind of a program? And we certainly looked to the research that's already been done and recognized that there certainly are different approaches that can work. So this particular experiment was actually about this question of how would you get people to walk to work? If you're going to send them some messages, maybe they have an app and, you're going to send them little notifications. Well, what type of notification is going to get them out walking and reinforce that behavior effectively? So there's different approaches here. One that was tested was that you just send out messages that are hedonic in nature. So you emphasize that walking is something that people do, that you're doing this because it feels good. Alternatively, you could test this hypothesis that it is about, what you stand to save. It could be about saving money or resources. A third hypothesis that they addressed in this experiment was around norms. So maybe, a message that is telling people that the reason that they're walking to work, don't forget the reason you've walked to work is because you know that it's the right thing to do. It's the responsible choice. And so in this experiment, they were able to look and see, is there any change in behavior when you start to send people one or another of these types of messages that frame the reason why people do certain things. And what was learned is that the gain and norm-based framing is what really is leading to increases in walking. And that seemed to align with the goals that people articulate when they are asked why it is that this is the activity they choose. I think an extension here that would be useful is to think about, well, what are the goals or the motivators when it comes to energy upgrade motivations? And so research there is showing that people tend to engage in behaviors, upgrading to save energy for 3 different overarching reasons. So one is certainly economic. Another can be social or hedonic. And the last one can be more around norms and the environment. So using this kind of research, what we did is we tested different flavors of how you might frame the program out. And we tested these new versions of an email against the current state, which was very much one that emphasizes that you can save money, that you're going to get something that's free, and it's a traditional incentive condition, in other words. So on this slide, the savings and the free are the control condition. And then there's other ways of expressing to people what the value might be. So the waste aversion is to highlight that inefficient lighting and old appliances mean that what you're doing is wasting electricity that you've already paid for. Alternatively, we had this hypothesis that maybe it's about norms and the environment. So do your part, reduce your carbon footprint. There was another condition we tested, which was around something new. So this was hedonic. It was intended to make people imagine what it would be like if you could get something new delivered to your home, installed in your home. And the last was, again, hedonic in nature, so it's all about comfort. It's very tangible. This kind of program is going to ensure that you are able to live in a more comfortable, a brighter, a cozier home than you did before. And so we ran an experiment and were able to pit these different hypotheses against each other. And what we learned is that this framing, the effect of it depends on the type of household that you're in. Different things will appeal depending on where you're kind of coming from. So for example, if you happen to be in a low income population where you're eligible for other financial programs that you're already familiar with, a financial value proposition highlighting that you can get money from this particular program is not going to be what you want to go with, because people are going to be more likely to go with the program that they're most familiar with already, to take the certain amount of money that they know they can get there, as opposed to gambling on a brand new program. Instead, what is working best for that population is this promise of a cozier, a brighter home. So that hedonic comfort is the right framing for that particular group in our experiment. If we're talking about a more high...
Just wanted to mention that we are running short on time. We have 15 minutes left, and we did want some time for questions. So I just wanted to keep that in mind. And maybe if you're available for maybe 5 minutes after the hour, we can take extra time. But
yeah,
just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
So I'll just finish my story from here, and then maybe what we can do is take some questions afterwards. So what works as a message if we're thinking about a highly energy burdened home? Well, what we're learning here is that surprisingly, promising financial savings or a freebie, it's not as effective as if you were to tell people that they can get something new. It's surprising because you would think that sometimes financial incentives would be the way to go. And instead, what is learned here is that novelty seems to be this reward to people. They may not be able to get free things all the time because they're perhaps using their discretionary spending to make up for the fact that they do have this high energy burden. You know, they're not perhaps putting money towards home essentials. And so the ability to have something new installed is very appealing and is what seems to drive their perceptions of value for the program. The last point here is for those households that don't have an overly high energy burden, so they qualify for things like light bulbs, you know, they're probably doing okay on comfort. Their homes are probably not super freezing in the winter. The financial burden's probably not that bad. And so what is actually found to work the best when it comes to driving perceived value for these individuals is a little bit of a guilt trip around waste aversion. You're wasting energy that you've already paid for. So I think, you know, the key takeaways for us from the work that we've done in this particular project would be that perceived value is something that relies on a number of factors, and you won't quite know which one to go with unless you take advantage of being able to do some experimentation and testing. That way you know and can quantify the actual impact of your communication strategy before you deploy it. So that is definitely, you know, the hallmark, I think, for us as a takeaway. So I think at this point, why don't we pass things back over and we can take some questions.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very insightful presentation, really interesting, I think, to the BECC audience. So I'm going to ask now that Sarah also turns on her webcam if possible. And I'm sharing my screen now. Some of you have asked whether you can reach both Sarah and Michelle, and I encourage you to go to the BEworks website for that. So, Maxine, do you have questions?
Yes, so one question is to clarify something. Could you please elaborate on the difference between the savings framing and the waste framing?
Yes, absolutely. So savings would be, you know, don't leave money on the table. And I think the value of the other framing is that it's partly about something that you've paid for already. So you put an investment out there, and seeing it go to waste is much more powerful than just feeling like you would have to pay a little bit more out of your pocket. It's like you've already spent that money, so why let it go to waste?
All right, thank you. Another question here. Is there any research that speaks to whether people are more likely to change their behavior depending on who the messenger is? I.e., how does social influence impact our behavior choices?
Yes, definitely. So social dynamics, social factors play into these decisions all of the time, particularly when we're feeling unsure about what to do. So typically, you know, one bias that we might rely on would be looking to see what others do, or looking to see whether this seems like a source that is credible, if this is a source that's seen as an authority. And that was actually one of the other little challenges in this particular project. The organization that was making the funds available was not well known. The name is not one that rings as familiar to people. And so going back to something that Sarah had said around, you know, trust and free money. I mean, you're not going to take the free money at the booth because you're going to wonder what the catch is. And if you don't know the name of the organization that's sponsoring all of this, you might wonder, like, what do I have to do? Is there something that I don't know?
Sarah, you're going to need to
Sarah
unmute.
might be unmute.
Oh,
There you are.
weirdly glitchy there. Sorry. Yes, I will add to that there is a lot of research about yes, how we will, you know, take instructions or, you know, behavior implementation action or urging from different kinds of people, and be they our social community or people who we consider to be in a position of authority. And it can be very, very strong, and it can also be very nuanced. So you can probably think of this with a lot of the social maybe norms or shaming or anything that has been going on with COVID-19 lately. And it's not as, it can be the case that, you know, societal pressure or, you know, someone else telling you something or someone you think is an authority telling you to do something will get you to do it. But there are lots of cases where it's a little more nuanced than that. So we obviously don't, sometimes shame can backfire. Sometimes social pressure can backfire. You tell someone stop having a party at your house and they get mad at you and they throw a bigger party. Or issues with authority, people kind of pretty easily think that if I just say I'm an expert or I say I'm in a position of authority, like Michelle was saying, like we're this, you know, organization, then they'll listen to me. And with all of these behavioral tactics in behavioral economics, it is a little more nuanced like that. You can't just say I'm an expert. The person you are kind of trying to influence has to really feel like you are and has to really respect you as an authority and as an expert before those kinds of tactics and nudges will work. So people get into that kind of trickily often where they think it'll work and then it doesn't really play out that well.
Great. Another question we have here. So low-income customers get a lot of information about assistance like housing and food. How do you make sure you aren't competing with other forms of assistance? Like it's not one or the other.
Yes, I think that that goes back to one of the things that we learned in this case. You know, if you know that there are other financial assistance programs that are salient for people and you have other, you know, features of a program that will support people in a different way than just financial, there's value to emphasizing those things. So if you know that people will derive support from some other program for their financial needs or some proportion of them, then you could certainly say like there's, you know, financial value here for you also in this program, but maybe there's something here that you can't get elsewhere, such as, you know, alleviating the fact that your house is too cold in the winter. So gaining that comfort.
I'll also add before we take the next question that that case study that Michelle was taking us through, we do have a white paper publication on it. So if you want to know any more of the details or how things worked or other tactics that were tried and things that worked, you can certainly contact us and we can send that to you.
Great, another question. The framing seems to be centered on getting the recipient to focus on benefits to themselves. What about framing that asks the recipient to focus on benefits that they might achieve for loved ones, for example, children?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that that can also be quite powerful. And I know that, you know, framing around value that emphasizes benefits to others has been shown to work in many different contexts. This was one context where we didn't specifically test that hypothesis. So I can't speak to, you know, how it might have ranked relative to the other things that we tested, but certainly would be a curious question for us to address if we had the chance to do another experiment.
I think that what Michelle is saying about testing is the kind of the key point too, is that there's all these options and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. I know of, what state was it? There was some state who was trying to get people to come to free or, you know, affordable doctor's appointments. And part of what they, for flu shots.
Yes.
That's what it was, the flu shots. They were trying to get people to get their flu shots. And one of the tactics that they tried to use was saying, you know, it might help people with babies or it might help older people and things like that. And it actually, that particular one that they tested was not very successful. So there are certainly some instances where it can be helpful, but in that one, it wasn't that it was a horrible failure. It just wasn't as successful as some other ones. So definitely speaks to the value of, you know, there's good principles and there's good theory, and you kind of build those hypotheses for the options that you think might work best and then test them.
Okay, there's been a couple questions related to this question. Many assistance programs must require applicants to provide financial information to show their eligibility. How can communication approaches overcome the shaming effect?
Okay, so I'm thinking here, about another component of this particular project. And, you know, that's certainly a sensitive thing. And I think that you need to build trust into the process. One of the findings that we had here was that when the process feels cumbersome, even the next step, like uncertainty you might have around how long it takes to go through the process, or, you know, is it that someone's calling me or I have to call someone? Where are these people located? What is this program? When you don't feel trust, then you're not likely to make those kinds of disclosures. So certainly building trust in is important. And the way that you can do that is by making a process that feels easy, because people intuitively will pick up on that and they will think to themselves, no, okay, this is built for me. This is obviously a program that's thought about every part of my interaction with it. And even the first step for me is easy. So it must be keeping me at its heart. And another thing to add in here would be perhaps to consider technology as being the platform by which some information is taken from people, because technically, I think, or thinking to some of the research on technology is that people will disclose more when it is to a platform as opposed to a person.
That was a really good question, though.
Mm-hmm.
All right, another question here. How do your findings about too much information relate to sophisticated policymakers failing to respond to data about impending risks? So, for example, that a pandemic is coming.
Yeah. Sorry, Michelle, you can go ahead if you want.
You can go right ahead if you have an answer.
I mean, we're obviously, that's why I'm like, yes, information overload and information sharing is a huge issue right now, I think, as it has been for many, many years, especially with the advent of the internet, right? We all kind of thought, well, we're going to have access. It's the prime example of we thought we were going to have access to more information, therefore people will be better informed. And I think we all probably know that's not the case. And yeah, we definitely have done a lot of work helping organizations tailor their information, because there really is that, you know, more is not more. So people have definitely a capacity for information. A lot of the work that I did on my PhD was about the information capacity of the human brain and the information processing capacity of it. And certainly it is the case that you will lose people's attention and their cognitive effort that's involved. And so what we really frequently always are telling people and working with people to do are, okay, this giant page of text that I know you think people are going to read, but not only are they not going to probably understand it, but they'll probably stop reading it. What are the most important salient points, and how do we make that information as salient as possible? We have a couple, if you go on our website, we have a couple case studies kind of highlighting that specifically, and how we're still presenting the same information. Especially in one case, the BECC example case study was about financial information disclosure, and there are regulations. You have to disclose a certain amount of information to investors, but they're not reading through it, and they're not comprehending it, and they're not seeing like they're getting any value of it. So how do you still present the same amount of information, the same key points, in fewer words and in a way that is much more salient to people, where they will actually attend to it properly and get the message you want? Obviously not the case that, you know, just more information is more. People get the point pretty quickly.
Thank you. I'm sorry to cut it off here. We have loads of great questions, and it's been a really interesting and thoughtful presentation. For those who want to know more, you can contact Sarah and Michelle through BEworks, and we obviously will have the recording available on the BECC webinar website, and we'll send it to you after this session. I did want to remind everybody that the next webinar is again going to be a blockbuster with George Marshall, who is a former keynote at BECC, and you won't want to miss that. So register today for free on the BECC website. And again, just want to remind you that BECC is coming up December 6th to 9th, so stay posted. Thank you again to our speakers, Michelle and Sarah, and we will see you next month.